Picture this. 30,000 years before Christ, in the frozen valleys of what we now call Europe, the sun was your best friend, and the night was your executioner. Every single sunset brought genuine terror, not the kind of worry we feel today when our phone battery dies or when we're running late for a meeting. No, this was the raw, primal fear that came with knowing that in just a few hours you might become dinner for something with fangs the size of railroad spikes. This was the world of the Elk River tribe, and it was a world where darkness literally meant death. Now, imagine being the smallest, weakest member of that tribe. Meet Grok, and yes, I know that sounds like something out of a cartoon, but bear with me here. Grok was the youngest son of the tribal chief, and in a world where muscle meant survival, he was dealt a particularly cruel hand. His left arm hung slightly withered from a childhood fever, making him useless with a spear and practically worthless in the brutal calculus of Ice Age existence. While his brothers could bring down a mammoth with their hunting parties, Grok struggled to kill a rabbit. While they earned respect and status through displays of raw strength, he was relegated to gathering roots and helping the women tend to children. In our modern world, we might call him intellectually gifted. Back then, his tribe had a different word for someone whose mind wandered and who asked too many questions: cursed. But here's what made Grok different, and why his story matters to every single person listening to this right now. Where others saw only the terrifying randomness of their world, Grok saw patterns. When lightning split the sky during those bone-chilling thunderstorms, most people cowered and prayed to whatever spirits they believed controlled the chaos. Grok watched. He noticed how the brilliant flash was always followed by thunder. He observed how lightning seemed drawn to the tallest trees, the highest rocks. And, most importantly, he saw what happened after lightning struck. Picture this scene. The morning after a particularly violent storm, when the tribe emerged from their caves like nervous animals checking for predators. While everyone else was focused on finding food or counting their losses, Grok was staring at a blackened pine tree, still smoking from a direct lightning strike. The base of the tree glowed with tiny orange embers, and around it, the frozen ground was actually warm to the touch. Now, this is where Grok's mind worked differently than everyone else's. Most people saw destruction, a perfectly good tree turned into charcoal. Grok saw captured sunlight. He saw warmth that had somehow been trapped and contained. He saw fire. But understanding fire and controlling it are two completely different things, aren't they? Grok had observed the sky fire that occasionally consumed entire forests during dry seasons. He had seen how this destructive force could clear vast areas of land in hours, how it could kill massive animals, how it seemed to possess a terrifying life of its own. The very idea of trying to contain such power was not just dangerous, it was blasphemous. Enter Mora, the Bone Reader, the tribe's shaman and keeper of sacred wisdom. Picture her, ancient by Paleolithic standards at maybe 40 years old, her face weathered like old leather, her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that comes from decades of keeping a community alive through sheer force of will and accumulated knowledge. Mora had guided the Elk River tribe through famines, predator attacks, and brutal winters that would have broken lesser groups, and Mora saw Grok as a threat. It wasn't personal hatred, you understand. It was something far more dangerous: institutional fear. Every successful tribe in this era survived by following proven methods, sacred traditions that had kept their ancestors alive for countless generations. When someone starts questioning the fundamental assumptions of your survival system, when they start suggesting that humans might control forces reserved for the spirits themselves, well, that person becomes a walking threat to everything that has kept your people from extinction. The confrontation came during the autumn gathering, when the tribe met to share the summer's stories and prepare for the coming winter. Food was already scarce, it always was. As the cold months approached and tensions ran high, this was when Grok made his fatal mistake. Standing before the assembled tribe, with all the naive enthusiasm of youth, he dared to voice his forbidden idea. "What if," he said, his voice cracking with nervousness, "what if we could keep the sky fire after lightning brings it? What if we didn't have to fear the darkness, The silence that followed was deafening. Imagine that moment. 30 or 40 people who had spent their entire lives accepting that humans were helpless against the forces of nature, suddenly hearing one of their own suggest they could harness the power of the gods themselves. Mora, the bone reader, rose slowly, her joints creaking like old wood. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "The sky fire belongs to the spirits," she declared. "For a human to claim it is to invite their wrath upon all of us. The weakest among us seeks to make himself equal to the gods." And that was it. In a world where survival depended on group cohesion, where questioning sacred wisdom could doom an entire tribe, Grok had crossed a line from which there was no return. Tag, the tribal chieftain and Grok's own father, faced an impossible choice: keep his strange, weak son and risk the shaman's curse falling upon the entire tribe, or sacrifice him to preserve the group's survival. But Thag was also a politician, and he saw an opportunity to solve two problems at once. Grok had always been an embarrassment, a reminder of weakness in a bloodline that needed to project strength. By exiling him, Thag could appear decisive, religious, and ruthless all at once. The sentence was pronounced at dawn: exile, permanent banishment from the only community Grok had ever known. No weapons, no furs, no food, just the clothes on his back and the terrible burden of survival in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or the alone. As Grok gathered his few possessions and prepared to leave the only home he had ever known, his sister Asha approached him. Tears froze on her cheeks as she pressed a small bundle into his hands: dried meat, a flint knife, and a precious piece of pyrite that could spark when struck properly. "Brother," she whispered, "if the spirits truly speak to you, perhaps this exile is their way of teaching you something the rest of us are too afraid to learn." And so Grok walked out of the valley of the Elk River tribe into a wilderness that had killed countless humans before him, carrying nothing but his strange ideas and an unshakable belief that fire could be tamed. What he discovered in that frozen wasteland would change not just his own fate, but the destiny of every human being who would ever live. But that's a story for our next chapter. The first 3 months of exile nearly killed him. Picture Grok, this scrawny outcast with a withered arm, trying to survive alone in a landscape that would challenge even the most experienced hunter. We're talking about a world where the average temperature hovered around freezing even in summer, where every shadow could hide a predator, and where finding enough calories to survive each day was a full-time job for entire hunting parties. Grok found shelter in what could generously be called a cave, really just a shallow depression in a rocky hillside, barely large enough for him to lie down without his feet sticking out into the elements. The walls wept with moisture that froze solid every night, and the floor was nothing but bare stone that sucked the warmth from his body like a vampire. His diet? Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly what you'd call balanced nutrition. Roots that he had to dig from frozen ground with his bare hands until his fingers bled, grubs and insects when he could find them, carrion when he was desperate enough, and trust me, after a few weeks of exile, desperation becomes your constant companion. Imagine gnawing on the frozen remains of some animal that a saber-toothed cat had abandoned, all while keeping one eye open for the return of whatever killed it in the first place. But here's what's fascinating about human nature. Even when we're reduced to our most primitive survival mode, our minds keep working. Even when Grok was weak from hunger and shivering from cold, that restless intelligence that had gotten him exiled in the first place kept churning away. He began to study his environment with the intensity of a scientist. Which rocks held heat longest after the sun hit them? Where did the wind patterns create natural shelters? How did different animals track their prey, and how could he avoid becoming prey himself? And then came the night that changed everything. It was late autumn, maybe early winter time becomes fluid when you're fighting for survival every single day. A massive storm system had been building for days, the kind of weather event that even experienced tribes would hunker down to wait out. The air itself felt electric, charged with an energy that made your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. Grok huddled in his pathetic excuse for a shelter, listening to the wind howl like some primordial beast. The temperature had dropped so low that his breath formed instant clouds of ice crystals. This was the kind of night when exile meant death, when even the strongest humans might not see morning. And then the sky exploded. Picture this. A lightning bolt so massive, so brilliant, that for a split second the entire landscape was illuminated like noon. The thunder that followed wasn't just sound, it was a physical force that seemed to shake the very bedrock beneath Grok's feet, and directly in front of his cave, maybe 50 feet away, stood a dead pine tree that had just become something extraordinary. The tree was on fire, but not the wild, destructive fire that Grok had seen consume forests. This was different. This was contained, controllable, almost cooperative. The lightning had struck the tree's crown, but instead of igniting the whole thing in a massive blaze, it had created something more manageable. The dead wood was catching slowly, deliberately, creating a column of flame that danced and flickered but didn't spread beyond the tree itself. Now, here's where 99 out of 100 humans would have done the sensible thing: run. Fire was the domain of spirits, gods, forces beyond human comprehension. Approaching it would be like walking up to a tornado and trying to have a conversation. But Grok wasn't 99 out of 100 humans, was he? He was the exile, the questioner, the one whose strange mind saw patterns where others saw chaos. And what he saw in that burning tree wasn't just destruction, he saw opportunity. Fighting every instinct screaming at him to flee, Grok crept closer to the flaming pine. The heat hit him like a physical wall, warming his face for the first time in months. He could feel ice crystals melting in his beard, could sense his frozen muscles beginning to relax. But more than the physical warmth, he felt something else: possibility. Here's where Grok's previous observations became crucial. Remember how he'd noticed that certain stones sparked when struck together? How he'd seen that dried moss and bark could catch the smallest ember and nurse it into flame? All of those seemingly useless insights suddenly became the most valuable knowledge in the world. Working with trembling hands and not just from the cold, Grok began gathering materials. Dried grass from beneath overhanging, rocks where it had stayed relatively moisture-free, strips of bark from birch trees that peeled away in paper-thin layers, tiny twigs, then slightly larger ones, then branches thick as his thumb, and then came the moment of truth. Using a burning branch from the lightning-struck pine, Grok carefully, methodically, began the process of creating his own fire. Can you imagine the terror and excitement of that moment? Every story, every warning, every sacred teaching told him that what he was attempting was impossible, blasphemous, and deadly. But his cold, starving, desperate body told him something different: that warmth meant survival, and survival meant everything. The first attempt failed. His hands were shaking too badly, and he smothered the tiny flame before it could catch. The second attempt died when a gust of wind scattered his carefully prepared tinder, but the third time, magic happened. A tiny orange glow appeared in his bundle of dried moss, then a wisp of smoke. Then, with breath so gentle it was barely more than a whisper, Grok coaxed that ember into flame. And for the first time in 30,000 years of human history, a person had deliberately created fire. That first night with his captured flame was simultaneously the most terrifying and most wonderful experience of Grok's life. Every few minutes he had to feed the fire more fuel, learning through trial and error how much was too little and how much was too much. Too little, and the flames would die, leaving him colder and more desperate than before. Too much, and the fire would flare up so violently that he'd scramble backward in terror, convinced he'd awakened some angry spirit. But slowly, carefully, he began to understand fire's personality. It needed to breathe, smother it completely, and it would die. It needed food, starve it, and it would fade away. It needed protection from wind and rain, but it also needed air circulation. It was almost like caring for a living thing, a dangerous pet that could either save his life or burn him alive. And then came dawn, and with it, revelation. Grok had survived the night. More than survived, he had thrived. His body was warm for the first time in months. His clothes were dry. His cave, which had been a miserable hole in the rock, was now transformed into something that felt almost like home. But the real discovery came when he decided to experiment with cooking. He had a piece of tough, stringy mammoth meat carrion he'd scavenged days earlier that was so tough he could barely chew it raw. On a whim, he held it over his flames, watching as the surface began to change color, as fat started to sizzle and drip. The smell was incredible, rich, complex, mouth-watering in a way that raw meat could never be. But when he finally worked up the courage to taste it, the experience was revolutionary. The meat was tender, flavorful, easier to digest. More than that, it seemed to provide more energy, more satisfaction than raw food ever had. Without knowing it, Grok had just unlocked one of the most significant evolutionary advantages in human history. Cooked food was more nutritious, easier to digest, and provided more calories with less effort. This single discovery would eventually allow human brains to grow larger, human settlements to develop, and human civilization to become possible. But that first morning, Grok wasn't thinking about the future of humanity. He was thinking about something much simpler and more immediate. He was no longer helpless against the darkness. Word of the exile who commanded Skyfire spread like, well, wildfire. News travels fast in the Ice Age, even without social media. Within weeks of Grok's first successful firemaking, rumors began spreading through the scattered tribes of the region. Hunters returning from long expeditions whispered stories around their own cold campfires about the exile who had somehow captured the Skyfire. Traders passing between settlements carried tales of mysterious lights seen flickering in the valley where no lightning had struck, and people were curious, desperately, dangerously curious. The first visitor was Asha, Grok's sister, and her arrival nearly broke his heart. She appeared at the mouth of his cave on a bitter winter morning, carrying her infant son, a baby who was clearly dying from the kind of wasting sickness that claimed so many children in those brutal times. "Brother," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, "they say you command the spirits of warmth. My son, he grows cold no matter how many furs I wrap him in. Please. Now, put yourself in Grok's position for a moment." Here was his sister, the only family member who had shown him kindness during his exile, begging him to save her child. But helping her meant revealing his greatest secret, the knowledge that had taken months of dangerous experimentation to master. If word got back to the tribe about exactly how fire could be controlled, would they come to learn from him, or would they come to destroy him? Grok made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He built up his fire, creating a warm sanctuary in his cave, and taught Asha how to tend the flames while her son recovered in the blessed warmth. For 3 days, she stayed with him, learning the basics of firekeeping while her baby gradually returned to health. But when she left, she didn't go quietly back to the Elk River tribe. Word spread that the exile's magic had saved a dying child, and if fire could heal the sick, what else might it do? The trickle of visitors became a stream, then a flood. Desperate hunters arrived, begging for just one burning branch to take back to their families. Wise women came seeking to learn the secret of captured warmth. Even warriors appeared not to fight, but to trade furs and meat for access to the miraculous flames. And Grok, the weak exile who had been cast out for questioning sacred traditions, suddenly found himself with more power than he had ever imagined possible. Think about the revolutionary nature of what was happening here. For the first time in human history, someone had a technology that everyone wanted but no one else understood. Grok held a monopoly on the most valuable resource imaginable, the ability to create warmth and light on demand. But power, as they say, comes with responsibility. And Grok learned this lesson the hard way. Some visitors came with genuine need, families facing starvation, tribes devastated by predator attacks, children dying from exposure. These people, Grok helped gladly, teaching them basic fire-tending skills while keeping the deeper secrets of fire creation to himself. Others came with darker intentions, warriors who saw fire as the ultimate weapon, shamans who viewed Grok's knowledge as a threat to their own spiritual authority, thieves who hoped to steal burning branches and claim fire mastery for themselves. Grok quickly learned to read people, to distinguish between those who deserved fire's gifts and those who would use them for destruction. He developed what would become known as the fire laws, a complex code governing when flames could be shared and with whom. Want to learn fire tending? Prove your worthiness through service to the community. Demonstrate that you understand fire's responsibility along with its power. Want to take flames back to your tribe? Leave valuable trade goods as security and swear binding oaths about how the fire will be used. But it was Thag's attack that truly established Grok's legend. Picture this scene. Late autumn, nearly 2 years after Grok's exile, Thag, the tribal chieftain who had banished his own son, finally decided that Grok's growing influence posed too great a threat to ignore. Stories were spreading of the Firebringer's power, and some members of the Elk River tribe were beginning to question why they had cast out someone who could command spirits themselves. So Thag gathered 50 of his best warriors, a massive force by Ice Age standards, and marched on Grok's valley under cover of darkness. His plan was simple. Attack at night when fire magic would be most disorienting to his enemies. Overwhelm the exile and his few followers through sheer force of numbers, and claim the secret of fire-making for himself. What Thag didn't understand was that by the time he arrived, Grok was no longer alone. Remember all those grateful visitors? Many of them had stayed, some because they wanted to learn more about fire mastery, others because they recognized that serving the Firebringer offered more security than their previous lives of constant hunger and fear. Still others because they believed correctly, as it turned out that Grok's knowledge would reshape the world, and they wanted to be part of that transformation. The attack came just after midnight, when most settlements would be sleeping and defenseless. Thag's warriors crept through the valley, expecting to find a handful of people huddled around a single campfire. Instead, they found something that must have seemed like a vision from the spirit world itself. The entire valley was alive with light. Dozens of fires burned in strategic positions, turning night into day and revealing every shadow where an attacker might hide. Grok's followers, armed with flaming spears and burning arrows, rained down missiles of fire from elevated positions. Warriors who had spent their entire lives fighting in darkness suddenly found themselves exposed, illuminated, and facing weapons they had never encountered before. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't just military tactics, they were proof that Grok had indeed mastered forces beyond normal human understanding. Who fights with fire as a weapon? Who turns darkness into light at will? Only someone who commanded the spirits themselves. The Battle of Burning Spears, as it came to be known, lasted less than an hour. Thag's warriors fled in terror, spreading tales of the untouchable Fire Lord, whose mastery of the sky spirits made him invincible in battle. Some claimed they had seen Grok himself wreathed in flames like a living spirit. Others swore that he could create fire from thin air with just a gesture. None of it was true, of course, but legends have a way of growing in the telling, and the legend of the Firebringer was just getting started. In the years that followed, Grok's settlement grew into something unprecedented. The first human community built around technological rather than purely tribal bonds. People came from hundreds of miles away to learn fire mastery, to trade for flames, or simply to witness the miracle of controlled fire for themselves. And with growth came specialization. Jara, the flamekeeper, who tended the great central fire that burned continuously day and night. Brok, the smokemaster, who discovered that meat could be preserved for weeks in the smoke from certain woods. Neela, the fire dancer, who developed elaborate rituals around flame tending that helped newcomers understand fire's sacred nature. Women working near the fires discovered that certain clay hardened when heated, birthing pottery and the ability to store water and food in ways never before possible. Children raised in the warmth and security of the fire caves grew taller and stronger than their parents, their developing brains nourished by cooked food and stimulated by the complex social interactions that evening fires made possible. But perhaps most importantly, those evening gatherings around the flames became humanity's first classrooms. For the first time in human history, people had secure, well-lit spaces where knowledge could be shared, discussed, and refined. Stories that had once been told hurriedly during brief daylight hours could now be developed into complex epics. Technical knowledge about hunting, tool-making, and survival could be demonstrated and practiced safely. Language itself evolved around those fires, becoming more sophisticated as people needed words to describe their new technologies and social arrangements. Yet Grok, now in his 30s and considered ancient by Ice Age standards, faced a problem that would have made any modern business leader nervous. His monopoly was unsustainable. Fire was too valuable, too useful, too revolutionary to remain the secret of one community forever. Already, other groups were experimenting with captured flames, trying to reverse engineer the fire-making process. It was only a matter of time before someone else independently discovered the techniques that Grok had pioneered. So he made a decision that demonstrated remarkable foresight. Rather than trying to hoard fire knowledge until his death, Grok chose to control its spread by directing it himself. He selected 12 of his most trusted followers, people who had demonstrated not just technical skill but also wisdom, judgment, and understanding of fire's responsibilities. Each was taught the complete fire-making process, from initial spark to sustained flame. Each was given supplies, tools, and most importantly, a burning torch lit from the original hearth that legend said had burned continuously since Grok first tamed lightning. And then he sent them out into the world, with instructions to travel to distant lands and establish new fire caves, always remembering that fire's greatest power lay not in hoarding but in sharing carefully, wisely, but sharing nonetheless. Within a single generation, fire would spread across continents, and with it would come the transformation of everything humans thought they knew about survival, community, and their place in the natural world. But that transformation would come at a cost that even Grok couldn't have imagined. Grok died at the remarkable age of 43, which in the Paleolithic world made him practically a walking fossil. By modern standards, he would have been entering middle age. By Ice Age standards, he had lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren take their first steps. But here's what makes Grok's death different from every human death that came before it. He died knowing that his discovery would outlive him. Picture his final days in the original fire cave, now expanded into a complex of interconnected chambers that housed nearly 200 people. The walls were covered with the world's first permanent artwork paintings created by firelight, depicting hunts and spirits and stories that could now be preserved for future generations. The central hearth that had started as a desperate exile's survival experiment had become the original hearth, tended day and night by dedicated keepers who considered it their sacred duty to ensure the flame never died. As Grok lay dying, wrapped in furs and warmed by the fire he had first captured decades earlier, messengers arrived with news from across the known world. His 12 fire carriers had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. From the frozen shores of what would one day be called Scandinavia to the warmer valleys of the future Mediterranean, new fire caves were sprouting like mushrooms after rain. But the most remarkable news came from places Grok had never even imagined. Independent firemakers were emerging everywhere, curious minds who had observed the techniques of Grok's disciples and learned to create their own flames. What had started as one man's desperate experiment was becoming a global revolution. And revolution is exactly the right word for what happened next. Within 3 generations of Grok's death, fire had spread across continents with the speed and inexorability of a wildfire itself. But unlike wildfire, this spread was controlled, purposeful, and transformative in ways that even Grok hadn't anticipated. Consider the Ice Age migrations that followed. For tens of thousands of years, human expansion had been limited by climate and terrain. Frozen lands were uninhabitable because humans simply couldn't generate enough warmth to survive extended cold periods. Mountain passes were impassable because the high altitudes meant death by exposure. Fire changed all of that overnight. Suddenly, humans equipped with portable hearths could venture into territories that had been forbidden since the ice sheets formed. They could establish permanent camps in frozen valleys, survive blizzards that would have killed previous generations, and maintain body heat during the kind of extended cold snaps that had once meant certain death. Picture these early fire-equipped migrations, groups of 50 or 60 people moving across landscapes that no human had ever successfully traversed, carrying their most precious possession, burning embers carefully tended in portable fire pots made from hollowed-out stones. These weren't just hunting expeditions or seasonal movements. These were permanent relocations into new worlds, made possible by humanity's newest superpower. The psychological impact was just as dramatic as the practical benefits. For the first time in human history, people were no longer passive victims of their environment. They were active shapers of it. Forest too dense to travel through? Fire could clear a path. Predators claiming the best shelters? Fire could drive them away. Meat spoiling too quickly in warm weather? Smoke could preserve it indefinitely. But the deepest changes were happening at the molecular level, in ways that wouldn't be understood for another 30,000 years. Cooked food was rewiring human biology itself. The extra nutrition and easier digestion that fire-prepared meals provided meant that human brains could grow larger without requiring more total calories. Children raised on cooked food developed faster, learned more quickly, and reached physical maturity earlier than their ancestors. More importantly, the time savings were enormous. Raw food requires massive amounts of chewing, up to 5 or 6 hours per day for an adult getting enough nutrition to survive. Cooked food could provide the same nutrition in a fraction of the time, freeing up hours every day for other activities. And what did humans do with those extra hours? They gathered around fires and talked. Those evening conversations, made possible by extended light and communal warmth, became the birthplace of everything we now call culture. Complex language developed as people needed words to describe their new technologies and social relationships. Storytelling evolved from simple warnings about predators into elaborate mythologies that could be passed down through generations. Music emerged as people discovered that certain sounds carried better in the acoustics created by fire-warmed caves. Dance developed as communities celebrated their mastery over darkness and cold. Art flourished as steady firelight allowed for detailed work that had been impossible in the brief, unreliable light of day. But perhaps most importantly, fire enabled the development of specialized roles within communities. When survival no longer required every waking hour, people could become experts in particular skills. The best stoneworkers could focus on creating tools. The most observant weather readers could specialize in predicting storms. The most gifted storytellers could become keepers of tribal knowledge. And then came metallurgy. Grok's great-grandson, a curious young man named Harald who had inherited his ancestors' restless mind, made a discovery that would reshape civilization even more dramatically than fire itself. While experimenting with extremely hot fires, the kind fed with special woods and tended carefully to achieve maximum heat, Harald noticed that certain green-colored stones placed near the flames didn't just get hot, they melted. When the stones cooled, they had transformed into something entirely new, a reddish metal that was harder than any stone, sharper than any flint, and could be shaped while hot into any form imaginable. Harald had discovered copper, and with it, humanity had entered the Metal Age. Fire-cleared land made agriculture possible, as communities learned they could use controlled burns to create fertile fields for growing food. Protective flames allowed for the development of permanent settlements as people no longer needed to constantly move to find new hunting grounds. The combination of agriculture and permanent settlements led to population growth, which led to trade networks, which led to the first true cities. But the most profound change was invisible, and would remain so for millennia. Fire had fundamentally altered human consciousness itself. Think about it this way. For hundreds of thousands of years, human experience had been rigidly divided between day and night, between the time of activity and the time of helpless waiting for dawn. Fire eliminated that division. Suddenly, humans had a choice about when to be active, when to sleep, when to work, and when to socialize. Those evening hours around the flames, hours that had previously been lost to darkness and fear, became the foundation of human civilization. Every philosophical conversation, every technological innovation, every social bond that extended beyond immediate family ties, every story that preserved knowledge for future generations, all of it traced back to people sitting around fires and talking. Today, 30,000 years after Grok first captured lightning in a pine tree, we still reenact his discovery every time we light a candle, strike a match, or gather around a campfire. The mechanisms are more sophisticated now, but the fundamental human relationship with fire remains unchanged. We still use it for warmth, for cooking, for light, for community gatherings, and for the simple, profound comfort of watching flames dance. Every time you flip a light switch, you're tapping into power systems that are just more complex versions of Grok's first fire. Every time you cook a meal, you're using techniques that descend directly from his desperate experiments with that burning pine tree. Every time you sit around a campfire with friends, sharing stories and building relationships, you're participating in a tradition that has continued unbroken for 300 centuries. But perhaps Grok's greatest legacy isn't the fire itself. It's the courage he demonstrated in that frozen cave 30,000 years ago, the courage to question the forbidden, to experiment with the unknown, and to share dangerous knowledge because he believed it could make life better for everyone. In a world that told him humans must accept their limitations, Grok chose to challenge darkness itself. In a society that punished questioners and exiled troublemakers, he persisted in believing that there had to be a better way. In the face of almost certain death, he chose curiosity over conformity. His true monument isn't the fire caves that tourists once visited, or the legends that grew up around his name, or even the technological revolution he triggered. His real legacy is the living fire that burns in every human heart today, the spark that drives us to explore, to experiment, to refuse to accept that things must always be the way they've always been. Every scientific breakthrough, every technological innovation, every moment when someone looks at an impossible problem and says, "What if there's another way?" all of it traces back to a weak, exiled young man who decided that humans didn't have to be helpless against the darkness. Fire didn't just warm our bodies and cook our food. It illuminated the human spirit itself, showing us that we have the power to transform not just our environment, but our very understanding of what it means to be human. And that flame, the flame of human curiosity and determination and hope, burns as brightly today as it did in that first desperate night, when Grok chose light over darkness, knowledge over ignorance, and possibility over despair. That fire will never die, because it doesn't burn in any hearth or lamp or star. It burns in us.